The blood trail behind her painted a story of desperation across the dusty Montana earth, each crimson drop marking her struggle toward the distant lights of the ranch house that shimmered like a mirage through her fading vision. Elena Bradshaw had been riding for 3 days straight when the bullet tore through her side just outside of Helena. She had been carrying dispatch papers for the territorial government, a job she had taken on after her father's death left her with nothing but debts and a fast horse. The men who ambushed her wanted those papers, wanted the information about the gold shipment routes that would be traveling through the territory in the coming weeks. She had refused to hand them over, and they had shot her for it. Her horse had bolted at the gunfire, carrying her miles away before finally throwing her when it spooked at a rattlesnake. The fall had reopened the wound she had tried desperately to bind with strips of her petticoat, and now she was crawling on her hands and knees through the September grass, leaving a trail that any fool could follow. The ranch house grew larger as she dragged herself forward, her arms shaking with the effort. She could see the barn now, could make out the corral where horses moved restlessly in the twilight. Her vision blurred and cleared, blurred and cleared. She tasted copper in her mouth. The papers were still tucked inside her shirt, pressed against her ribs, the only thing she had managed to protect when everything else had fallen apart. Her mother would have been ashamed to see her like this, crawling through the dirt like a wounded animal, but her mother had been dead for 5 years and could not judge her anymore. The front porch seemed impossibly far away. She reached for it anyway, her fingers clawing at the wooden steps. A sound escaped her throat, half cry and half groan. The world tilted sideways and she felt herself falling, felt the darkness rushing up to meet her like water closing over her head. The door opened and light spilled out across the porch. She heard boots on wood, heard a man's voice saying something she could not quite understand. Strong hands lifted her, and she wanted to fight, wanted to scream that she would not let them take the papers, but her body would not obey her anymore. She felt herself being carried, felt the warmth of the house enveloping her, and then there was nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat growing fainter and fainter in her ears. When she woke, the first thing she saw was the rough-hewn ceiling beams above her head. The second thing she noticed was the absence of pain, or rather, the muted quality of it, as though someone had wrapped it in cotton and pushed it far away. She turned her head slowly and saw that she was lying on a bed in a small room with whitewashed walls. A lamp burned on the table beside her, casting warm light across handmade quilts and simple wooden furniture. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through her side. A man appeared in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of working outdoors. He crossed the room quickly when he saw her moving, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Easy now," he said, his voice deep and steady. "You have been unconscious for near about 18 hours. I pulled a bullet out of your side and stitched you up, but you lost a powerful amount of blood." Elena stared at him, trying to make sense of his words through the fog in her head. "Who are you?" "Name is Dalton Kincaid. This is my ranch, about 15 miles north of Fort Benton. You came crawling up to my porch last night, looking like death itself was chasing you." He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, studying her with an expression that was equal parts concern and curiosity. "You want to tell me what happened?" She tried to remember what she was supposed to say, what story she had prepared for situations like this, but her mind felt slow and clumsy. "I was riding, got ambushed. I figured that much from the bullet hole." His voice was dry but not unkind. "Question is why someone would be shooting at a woman traveling alone through the territory." Elena's hand moved instinctively to her side, feeling for the papers. They were gone. Panic flooded through her and she tried to sit up again, her breath coming in short gasps. "Where are my things? I had something. Papers, I need them back." Dalton placed a hand on her shoulder, gently but firmly pushing her back down against the pillows. "Calm yourself, your papers are safe. I did not read them, if that is what you are worried about. They are in the drawer there, along with what was left of your clothes. He paused, his gray eyes studying her face. You want to tell me why government dispatch papers are important enough to get yourself killed over? She met his gaze and saw no deception there, only honest concern. Something in her chest loosened slightly. They are not supposed to fall into the wrong hands. There is information about gold shipments, routes, and timing. Men would kill for that knowledge. Men already tried to kill you for it. He stood up and crossed to a small table where a pitcher and basin sat. He poured water into a cup and brought it back to her. Here, you need to drink something. She took the cup with trembling hands and sipped carefully. The water was cool and clean, and she had not realized how thirsty she was until it touched her lips. She drank it all, and he refilled it without being asked. When she had emptied the second cup, he set it aside and sat back down. You have a name? He asked. Elena Bradshaw. Well, Miss Bradshaw, you are welcome to stay here until you are well enough to travel. But I think you should know that whoever shot you left a trail a blind man could follow. If they want those papers badly enough, they will come looking for you. The fear that had been lurking at the edges of her consciousness rushed back in full force. Then I need to leave. I cannot bring trouble to your door. You are not going anywhere in your condition. You try to ride now, and you will tear open those stitches and bleed to death before you make it 5 miles. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I have a rifle, and I know how to use it. Let them come if they are fool enough, but you are staying put until you can sit a horse without falling off. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could take care of herself, but the exhaustion weighing down her limbs told a different story. Why are you helping me? You do not even know me. Something flickered across his face, an emotion she could not quite read. Let us just say I know what it is like to need help and not have anywhere to turn. Besides, my mother would rise from her grave and haunt me if I turned away someone in need. He stood up and moved toward the door. You should rest. I will bring you some broth in a few hours. You need to get your strength back. Wait! The word came out more desperately than she intended. He turned back, one eyebrow raised. Thank you for saving my life. He nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with the lamplight and the sound of wind moving through the eaves of the house. Over the next few days, Elena learned the rhythms of the Kincaid ranch. Dalton rose before dawn to tend to his cattle and horses, worked through the morning and afternoon, and returned to the house as the sun was setting. He brought her meals 3 times a day, simple but hearty food that gradually helped her regain her strength. He changed her bandages with a gentleness that surprised her, his hands steady and sure as he cleaned the wound and applied fresh dressings. He did not press her for more information about the ambush or the papers, and she was grateful for his discretion. On the 4th day, she was strong enough to sit up without feeling like the room was spinning. Dalton helped her into a chair by the window where she could look out at the rolling hills and distant mountains. It was beautiful country, wild and open in a way that made her heart ache. She had grown up in St. Louis, in a house with papered walls and carpeted floors, but her father had brought her west when she was 15, and she had fallen in love with the territory immediately. How long have you had this ranch? She asked as Dalton set a tray of food on the small table beside her. Going on 7 years now. Bought it with money I saved working cattle drives. It is not much, but it is mine. He glanced out the window at the land beyond. I have about 200 head of cattle and a dozen horses, enough to make a living. You run it alone? I have a ranch hand who comes up from town a few days a week to help with the heavy work. Otherwise, yes, it is just me. He pulled up another chair and sat down across from her. What about you? What is a woman from the East doing carrying government papers through Montana territory? Elena picked at the bread on her plate, considering how much to tell him. My father worked for the territorial government. He was a surveyor and cartographer. When he died 6 months ago, I needed work, and they offered me a position as a courier. The pay is good, and I know how to ride and shoot, so it seemed like a reasonable choice. Reasonable, Dalton repeated, his tone skeptical. Most women would not consider getting shot at reasonable work. Most women have families to fall back on when times get hard. I have no one. She met his eyes steadily. I do what I must to survive. He studied her for a long moment, and she had the strange sensation that he was seeing past all her defenses, seeing the fear and loneliness she worked so hard to hide. I understand that, he said finally, more than you might think. She wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to know his story, but before she could form the words, the sound of horses approaching made them both freeze. Dalton was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window with a fluid grace that spoke of hard-earned reflexes. His hand went to the gun belt hanging on a peg by the door. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Do not make a sound." He strapped on the gun belt and grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall, then disappeared through the doorway. Elena's heart hammered in her chest as she heard the front door open and close, heard the sound of boots on the porch. She strained to hear voices, but could only make out the low rumble of men talking. Minutes passed like hours. She looked around the room for something, anything she could use as a weapon if needed, but there was nothing except the water pitcher, and that would be useless. Finally, she heard the horses riding away and Dalton's footsteps coming back down the hall. He appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "That was 3 men asking if I had seen a woman riding through this area. Said she stole something valuable, and they were looking to get it back." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I had not seen anyone matching that description. They did not look like they believed me, but they did not push it." They rode off toward the east. He set the rifle down and came to stand in front of her. "Miss Bradshaw, I need you to tell me the truth. What exactly is in those papers that has men willing to hunt you across the territory?" She took a shaky breath and told him everything. She told him about the gold shipment routes, about the men who had tried to force the information from her, about her desperate flight across country with no clear destination in mind. She told him about the ambush, about the moment the bullet had torn through her flesh and she had known with terrible certainty that she was going to die. And she told him about seeing his ranch house like a beacon in the darkness, about crawling toward it with the last of her strength. When she finished, Dalton was silent for a long time. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the land he had worked so hard to claim, his shoulders tense. "You need to get those papers to Fort Benton," he said at last. "The territorial marshal needs to know about this, and those routes need to be changed before someone gets killed. I know, but I am not strong enough yet to make the ride, and if those men are watching the roads, I will never make it." He turned to face her, and there was determination in his eyes. "Then we wait until you are strong enough, and I will ride with you. 2 guns are better than 1, and I know back trails that most folks have never heard of. We can get you there safely." "You would do that? Risk your life for papers that have nothing to do with you?" "I would do it for you," he said simply, and the words hung in the air between them like a promise. Elena felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fever that had plagued her for days. She looked at this man who had saved her life, who had tended her wounds and offered her sanctuary without asking for anything in return, and she realized with startling clarity that she trusted him completely. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded and picked up the tray she had barely touched. "Eat your food. You need your strength back if we are going to travel." Over the next week, Elena grew stronger. She graduated from sitting by the window to walking around the house, then out onto the porch where she could breathe in the crisp autumn air. Dalton watched her progress with the careful attention of someone who understood the difference between helping and smothering. He was there when she needed support, but he stepped back when she needed to prove to herself that she could manage on her own. They talked during those days, long conversations that stretched from morning coffee to evening starlight. She learned that he had grown up on a farm in Missouri, that he had left home at 17 after his parents died of cholera, that he had worked as a cowboy and ranch hand for years before saving enough money to buy his own land. He told her about the loneliness of building something from nothing, about the satisfaction of watching cattle grow fat on good grass, about the fear that always lurked in the back of his mind that one bad winter or one drought could wipe out everything he had built. She told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about her mother's death from consumption when Elena was 13, about following her father west because he could not bear to stay in the house where his wife had died. She told him about learning to ride and shoot, about the freedom she had found in the wide open spaces of the territory, about the crushing loneliness that had followed her father's death. They did not talk about feelings, did not acknowledge the way their eyes lingered on each other, or the way their hands seemed to find excuses to touch. But it was there between them, growing stronger with each passing day, a connection that neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. On the 8th day, Elena insisted on helping with the morning chores. Dalton tried to argue, but she gave him a look that suggested he would be wasting his breath, so he let her come out to the barn with him. She moved slowly, careful of her healing wound, but she managed to help feed the horses and collect eggs from the chickens that scratched around in the yard. The work felt good, felt normal in a way that nothing had felt normal since the ambush. They were in the barn when they heard the horses again. This time there was no mistaking the sound for anything but trouble. Dalton grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her toward the back of the barn, toward a small tack room that was hidden behind stacks of hay bales. "Get in there and stay quiet," he ordered, his voice hard with authority. "No matter what you hear, you stay hidden, understand?" She wanted to argue, wanted to stand beside him and fight, but she knew she would be more liability than help in her current condition. She nodded and slipped into the tack room, pulling the door almost closed behind her. Through the narrow crack, she could see Dalton checking his rifle, his movements calm and methodical, despite the danger approaching. The barn doors opened, and 3 men walked in, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. Elena recognized the one in front from her nightmares, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek and eyes like chips of ice. "Morning," Dalton said, his voice casual despite the tension radiating from his frame. "Something I can help you gentlemen with?" The scarred man smiled, but there was no humor in it. "We met a few days back. You remember? We were looking for a woman who stole something valuable." "I remember. I told you I had not seen her." "Funny thing about that." The man took a step forward, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "We have been watching the roads, watching the trails, and she has not passed by, which makes us think maybe you were not being entirely truthful with us." "Maybe she went around," Dalton suggested. "It is a big territory." "Maybe. Or maybe she is still here recovering from that bullet wound she took." Another step forward. "See, we tracked her blood trail right to your door, so we know she made it this far. Question is whether she left or whether you are hiding her." Elena's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. She saw Dalton's hand tighten on his rifle, saw the calculation in his eyes as he measured the distance between himself and the 3 men. "I think it is time for you to leave my property," Dalton said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. The scarred man laughed. "We will leave when we have what we came for. Either the woman or the paper she is carrying. We are not particular about which. Then you will be leaving empty-handed." Everything happened fast. The scarred man went for his gun, and Dalton brought the rifle up in one smooth motion. The crack of gunfire shattered the morning silence. The scarred man went down, clutching his shoulder, and the other 2 men scattered, drawing their own weapons. Dalton dove behind a water trough as bullets splintered the wood above his head. Elena could not stand it anymore. She burst from the tack room and grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the wall. One of the men was circling around toward Dalton's position, his attention focused on the water trough. He did not see her until she swung the pitchfork like a club, catching him hard across the shoulders. He went down with a grunt of pain, and his gun skittered across the barn floor. "Elena, get down!" Dalton shouted, but she was already moving. scooping up the fallen gun. The third man wheeled toward her, and she fired without thinking, without aiming. The bullet went wide, but it was enough to make him flinch, enough to give Dalton the opening he needed. Another rifle shot, and the third man crumpled, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. The barn filled with silence, broken only by the sound of their harsh breathing. Elena stood frozen, the gun still raised, her hands shaking. Dalton rose from behind the water trough and crossed to her in 3 long strides. He gently took the gun from her hands and set it aside, then pulled her against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head. "You are safe," he murmured. "It is over. You are safe." She realized she was crying, great gulping sobs that shook her whole body. He held her through it, his arms solid and warm around her. When the tears finally subsided, she pulled back enough to look up at him. "I have never shot at anyone before," she whispered. "You did what you had to do. You protected yourself." He brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his touch infinitely gentle. "You saved my life. That man would have had a clear shot if you had not stopped him." She looked past him at the 3 men on the barn floor. One was dead, one was unconscious, and the scarred man was groaning and clutching his shoulder. "What do we do with them?" "We tie them up and take them to Fort Benton along with those papers. The marshal will want to question them about the ambush and who hired them." He released her reluctantly and crossed to where the scarred man lay. He removed the man's gun belt and used rope from the barn to secure his hands behind his back. Elena helped as best she could, though her wound was aching fiercely, and she could feel blood seeping through the bandage. Dalton noticed immediately and ordered her back to the house, but she refused to leave until all 3 men were secure and locked in his small root cellar with a heavy door that would hold them until they could be transported to town. Back in the house, Dalton changed her bandage and checked the stitches. A few had torn loose in the struggle, but nothing that could not be repaired. He worked with quick efficiency, and she found herself watching his face, memorizing the line of his jaw and the way his brow furrowed in concentration. "Thank you," she said when he had finished, "for everything, for saving my life, for protecting me, for not turning me over to those men." He looked up at her, and there was something raw and vulnerable in his eyes. "Elena, I need to tell you something." Her breath caught in her throat. "What?" "These past days with you here, they have been the best days I have had since I bought this ranch. Maybe the best days I have had in my whole life." He took her hands in his calloused thumbs stroking across her knuckles. "I know this is not the time. I know you are hurt and scared, and we have men locked in my root cellar and a ride to Fort Benton ahead of us. But I need you to know that if you want to stay, if you want to make a life here, I would be honored beyond measure." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes again, but these were different tears, tears of joy and relief, and a hope she had not allowed herself to feel in so long. "You are asking me to stay? To stay here with you?" "I am asking you to marry me." The words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid that if he did not say them quickly, he would lose his nerve. "I know I do not have much to offer, just a ranch and a house and a man who has loved you since the moment he carried you bleeding up his front steps. But if that is enough, if I am enough, then I am yours for as long as you will have me." She laughed through her tears and launched herself at him, ignoring the protest from her healing wound. He caught her and held her close, and she could feel his heart racing beneath her palm. "Yes," she breathed against his neck. "Yes, I will marry you. I will stay with you and help you build this ranch and make a life together. Because I have loved you too, from the moment you told me I was safe, from the moment you decided that my life was worth risking yours." He pulled back just far enough to look at her face, to search her eyes for any hint of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that was tender and fierce and full of promise. She kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all her fear and gratitude and love into that single perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably get those men to the marshal before they find a way out of my root cellar." She laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "Probably. But after that, we are coming straight back here and you are going to kiss me like that again. That is a promise I am happy to keep." The ride to Fort Benton took the better part of the day. They loaded the 3 prisoners into a wagon, the scarred man cursing and threatening the whole way. Dalton rode his big bay gelding, while Elena rode his gentlest mare, a sweet-tempered sorrel who seemed to sense her rider's weakness and walked with extra care. The papers that had caused so much trouble rode safely in a leather satchel strapped across Dalton's back. They stopped once to rest the horses and let Elena catch her breath. The wound was bothering her more than she wanted to admit, a constant burning ache that made her dizzy if she moved too quickly. Dalton noticed, of course, and made her drink water and eat some of the bread and cheese he had packed. He checked her bandage and was relieved to see that the bleeding had stopped. "We will be there in another 2 hours," he assured her. "Then you can rest while I deal with the marshal and get these men behind bars where they belong." "I need to be there when you talk to the marshal," she insisted. "I am the courier. I need to deliver the papers myself and make my report." He looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. "All right. But after that, you are going to the doctor and getting properly looked at. No arguments." "No arguments," she agreed. Fort Benton was a bustling town situated along the Missouri River, one of the most important trading posts in Montana Territory. The streets were crowded with freight wagons and pack trains, with miners heading to the gold fields and traders bringing goods upriver from St. Louis. The noise and activity was overwhelming after the quiet of the ranch, and Elena found herself pressing closer to Dalton's side as they navigated through the crowds. The marshal's office was near the center of town, a squat wooden building with bars on the windows. Dalton drove the wagon right up to the front door and tied off the horses before helping Elena down. Her legs were shaky from the long ride, but she managed to stand on her own. Together they entered the office. Marshal Thomas Garrett was a grizzled man in his 50s with iron gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He looked up from the papers on his desk, and his expression shifted from mild curiosity to sharp attention when he saw the state of Elena's clothes and the grim look on Dalton's face. "What can I do for you folks?" he asked, rising from his chair. "We have 3 men outside who need to be locked up," Dalton said. "They ambushed Miss Bradshaw about 10 days ago while she was carrying dispatch papers. They shot her and would have killed her if her horse had not bolted. Then they tracked her to my ranch and tried to take the papers by force." The marshal's eyebrows shot up. "That is quite a story. You have proof of these accusations?" Elena stepped forward and pulled the leather satchel off Dalton's back. She opened it and withdrew the papers, now stained with her blood but still legible. "I am Elena Bradshaw, courier for the territorial government. These are dispatch papers detailing gold shipment routes. The men outside wanted this information so they could plan robberies. When I refused to give it to them, they shot me." Marshal Garrett took the papers and examined them carefully, his expression growing darker with each page he turned. "This is valuable information indeed, the kind of information that could make men rich if they were willing to kill for it." He looked up at Elena with new respect. "You did well to protect these, Miss Bradshaw. A lot of people could have died if this fell into the wrong hands." "She nearly died protecting them," Dalton said, his voice rough with emotion. "If she had not made it to my ranch, she would have bled to death out in the wilderness. Then it is fortunate you found each other." The marshal moved toward the door. "Let us have a look at these would-be thieves." They went outside, and the marshal examined each of the 3 prisoners in turn. The scarred man, whose name turned out to be Jack Coburn, had a long history of robbery and violence. The other 2 were lesser criminals, men who had fallen in with Coburn for the promise of easy money. All three were locked in the cells at the back of the office, and the marshal promised that they would stand trial for attempted murder and theft of government property. "What about Miss Bradshaw's fee for delivering the papers?" Dalton asked. "She completed her job despite being shot and hunted. She deserves to be paid." The marshal nodded. "I will make sure the territorial office knows what happened. You will receive your full fee plus hazard pay, Miss Bradshaw. It may take a few weeks for the paperwork to go through, but the money will come." Elena thanked him, relieved that she would have funds to start her new life. Dalton took her to the doctor next, an elderly man named Dr. Fletcher, who examined her wound with gentle hands and declared that whoever had stitched her up had done an excellent job. "Keep it clean and dry for another week," he instructed. "No heavy lifting or strenuous activity for at least a month. You were very lucky, young lady. That bullet missed anything vital by less than an inch." "I had a good doctor," Elena said, glancing at Dalton with a smile that made his ears turn red. They spent that night at the boarding house in town, in separate rooms despite the knowing looks from the proprietor. Elena lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the town through the thin walls, and found herself wishing Dalton was there beside her. The thought would have scandalized her mother, but her mother was gone and Elena was building a new life on her own terms. In the morning, they met with a minister at the small church on the edge of town. Reverend Phillips was a kind man with gentle eyes who listened to their story without judgment. When Dalton asked if he would marry them, the Reverend smiled and said it would be his honor. "When were you thinking of having the ceremony?" he asked. Dalton looked at Elena, and she saw the question in his eyes. How long did she want to wait? Did she want a proper engagement? Time to plan and prepare? "Today," she said firmly. "I want to marry him today." The Reverend raised his eyebrows but nodded. "I can do that. Do you have rings?" They did not, but the general store across the street had a small selection of wedding bands. Dalton bought 2 simple gold rings that fit perfectly, and Elena had to blink back tears as he slipped one onto her finger. They were married that afternoon, in the little church with the Reverend's wife and the store owner as witnesses. Elena wore a simple blue dress purchased that morning, and Dalton wore his best shirt with his dark hair slicked back. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife and told Dalton he could kiss his bride, Elena felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. Elena rode beside her husband, savoring the word in her mind, and felt like she had finally found the place where she belonged. The next few months passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Elena's wound healed completely, leaving only a thin scar that Dalton kissed reverently whenever he saw it. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, learned to rope and brand cattle, learned to mend fences and birth calves. Her hands became calloused and her skin turned brown from the sun, and she had never felt more beautiful or more alive. Dalton taught her everything he knew about running a ranch, treating her as a partner rather than a delicate flower to be protected. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, and at night they fell into bed exhausted and content, wrapped in each other's arms. The money from the territorial government came through in November, a substantial sum that included hazard pay and a bonus for protecting valuable information. Elena used part of it to buy a small herd of sheep, thinking to diversify their income with wool production. Dalton was skeptical at first, but he trusted her judgment, and by spring the sheep were thriving, and Elena was learning to spin and weave. Winter came hard and cold to Montana, with snow piling high against the barn doors and temperatures that made the water in the trough freeze solid. But the house stayed warm thanks to the wood stove Dalton kept burning day and night, and there was something magical about being snowed in together, cut off from the rest of the world. On Christmas morning, Elena woke to find a package wrapped in brown paper sitting on the table beside the bed. She opened it carefully and gasped when she saw the contents: a beautiful leather journal with her initials embossed on the cover, and a set of good pencils. "For writing down your thoughts," Dalton said, propped up on one elbow beside her. or drawing if you prefer. I have noticed you looking at the mountains sometimes with that expression people get when they want to capture something permanent. She threw her arms around him, the journal clutched to her chest. It is perfect. Thank you. There is something else. He reached under his pillow and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a chain. It was my mother's. I want you to have it. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she opened the locket and saw the tiny photographs inside. A stern-looking man and a woman with kind eyes. Your parents? He nodded. They would have loved you, my mother especially. She always said I needed someone strong enough to stand beside me, not behind me. That is you. She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and they spent the rest of Christmas morning wrapped in each other and the quiet joy of being together. Spring brought new life to the ranch. Calves were born in the fields. The sheep had lambs, and Elena discovered she was pregnant. She told Dalton one evening in late April as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. He stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through shock and joy and terror in rapid succession. You are sure? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I am sure. Dr. Fletcher confirmed it yesterday when I went to town for supplies. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. We are going to have a baby. He pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. She felt dampness on her neck and realized he was crying, this strong man who faced down outlaws without flinching. The knowledge that he could be so moved by the prospect of becoming a father made her love him even more. I am going to be a father, he said wonderingly, pulling back to look at her. I am going to have a family. We are going to have a family, she corrected, and he laughed and kissed her until they were both breathless. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Elena continued to work on the ranch, though Dalton fussed over her constantly and tried to keep her from doing anything he considered too strenuous. She tolerated his concern with good humor, knowing it came from a place of love and fear of losing her. In late August, a letter arrived from the territorial government offering Elena a permanent position as a courier supervisor, managing other riders and coordinating dispatch deliveries across Montana. The pay was excellent and the work would be less dangerous, mostly administrative tasks that could be done from Fort Benton or even from their ranch. She discussed it with Dalton that evening over dinner. It would mean regular income beyond what the ranch brings in. We could hire more help, expand the herd, maybe build a bigger barn, and I could do most of the work here, only traveling to town once or twice a month. Is it what you want? He asked, watching her face carefully. She considered the question seriously. I think so. I am good at organizing and planning, and I like the idea of helping other couriers avoid what happened to me. I could train them, teach them how to stay safe. She paused, one hand resting on her swollen belly. But I want to make sure you are comfortable with it. This is your ranch. Our ranch, he corrected firmly. And if this is something you want to do, then I support you completely. You are smart and capable, and those are exactly the qualities needed for a job like that. She accepted the position, and in September she traveled to Fort Benton to meet with her new team. There were 5 couriers working the Montana routes, all men who looked skeptical when they first saw their new supervisor was a woman. But Elena quickly proved herself by demonstrating her knowledge of the territory and the practical skills needed to survive on the trails. By the end of the first meeting, she had earned their respect, if not their complete trust. The baby came in early November, arriving 3 weeks earlier than expected during a snowstorm that made travel impossible. Dr. Fletcher could not make it out to the ranch, so Dalton delivered his own son with Elena's guidance and the help of a book on midwifery they had purchased months earlier. It was terrifying and messy, and the most incredible experience of his life. They named him Daniel Thomas Kincaid, after Dalton's father and the marshal who had helped them when they needed it most. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's strong jaw, and both of his parents agreed he was the most beautiful baby ever born. Elena recovered quickly from the birth, and within weeks, she was back to managing her courier team, though now she did most of her work from a desk in their bedroom with Daniel sleeping in a cradle beside her. Dalton was a devoted father, taking the baby with him on ranch chores in a sling Elena had fashioned from an old shirt, talking to his son about cattle and horses and the land they would build together. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier than before, but rich with purpose and love. The ranch prospered, the courier service ran smoothly, and their family grew in happiness, if not yet in number. Elena kept her journal faithfully, filling page after page with drawings of the mountains and stories of their life together. Sometimes she would read passages aloud to Dalton in the evenings, and he would listen with a smile on his face, marveling that this was his life now. 2 years passed in what felt like moments. Daniel grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's fearlessness and his mother's curiosity. He followed Dalton everywhere, his small legs working hard to keep up as they checked fences and moved cattle. Elena watched them together and felt such overwhelming love that it sometimes took her breath away. In the spring of 1883, Elena discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was met with excitement rather than terror, though Dalton still hovered over her like a nervous hen. Their daughter, Grace Elizabeth Kincaid, was born in September during a golden autumn afternoon with Dr. Fletcher in attendance and Daniel fascinated by his new baby sister. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. They built a bigger barn and expanded their herd to over 500 head of cattle. The sheep operation had become so successful that Elena hired a shepherd to help manage the growing flock. Her courier service had expanded to cover routes throughout Montana and into Wyoming, and she had a small office in Fort Benton staffed by a clerk who handled the administrative details, while she focused on training and strategy. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Dalton took Elena on a picnic to the spot where she had first crawled onto his land, bleeding and desperate. They stood looking at the ranch house in the distance, at the new barn and the corrals full of horses, at the smoke rising from the chimney where their children were being watched by the neighbor woman for the afternoon. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked, leaning back against his chest. "Taking me in that night? Your life would have been simpler if you had just let me die." He turned her around to face him, his hands cupping her face. "My life would have been empty if I had let you die. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Elena Kincaid. You and our children, and the life we have built together. I would not change a single moment, not even the scary ones." She kissed him, long and deep, tasting the love and commitment that had only grown stronger over the years. "I love you. From that first moment when you carried me into your house and told me I was safe, I have loved you. And I love you. I will love you until the day I die and beyond, if there is anything beyond." He pulled her close, and they stood wrapped in each other, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. The years continued to pass, bringing challenges and triumphs in equal measure. There were harsh winters that tested their endurance, droughts that made them worry about water for the herds, good years when the calves were strong and the wool prices high. Daniel grew into a tall boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's sharp mind. Grace was small and fierce, afraid of nothing, climbing trees and riding horses before she could properly walk. Elena's courier service became one of the most respected in the territory, known for its reliability and the high standards she demanded of her riders. She trained dozens of men and eventually a few women in the skills needed to survive on the dangerous trails, and not one of her riders was ever killed in an ambush. The territorial government recognized her contributions with commendations and pay increases, and she used the money to continue improving the ranch and securing their future. Dalton became known as one of the best cattlemen in Montana, his herd producing strong calves year after year. He served on the local Cattlemen's Association, helping to establish fair grazing rights and prevent range wars. Other ranchers sought his advice on breeding and management, and he was generous with his knowledge, believing that a rising tide lifted all boats. In 1887, when Daniel was 6 and Grace was 4, Elena gave birth to twin boys, Henry and James. The births were difficult, and Dr. Fletcher warned them that Elena should not have any more children, that another pregnancy could kill her. It was a sobering conversation, but Dalton and Elena agreed that their family was complete, that 4 healthy children were more blessings than they had ever expected. The twins were as different as night and day despite sharing a face. Henry was cautious and thoughtful, preferring books to horses. James was wild and reckless, always getting into trouble and dragging his siblings along on his adventures. Together, they kept their parents exhausted and laughing in equal measure. As the children grew, the ranch grew with them. They hired permanent ranch hands, built a bunkhouse to house them, and expanded into horse breeding in addition to cattle and sheep. The ranch that Dalton had started with nothing but determination and a dream had become one of the most successful operations in the territory. Elena continued to run her courier service, even as Montana moved toward statehood. She was there in November of 1889 when Montana officially became the 41st state in the Union, a witness to history and a participant in the growth and development of the land she had come to love so deeply. On a cool evening in October of 1891, Elena and Dalton sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Daniel, now 10, was teaching Grace how to rope a fence post. The twins were supposedly doing chores but seemed to be mostly chasing the dogs around the barn. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. "Do you remember the first night we sat on this porch together?" Elena asked, her hand finding Dalton's. "When I could barely walk and you were trying so hard not to hover?" He laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "I remember being terrified I was going to say something wrong and you would leave as soon as you were well enough. I was already half in love with you by then." "Only half?" she teased. "All right, completely in love. Head over heels, no hope of recovery." He squeezed her hand gently. "Best thing I ever did was carry you into this house." "Best thing I ever did was drag myself to your porch," she countered. "I thought I was dying, but really I was being born. This life, our family, everything we have built together, it all started with you choosing to save me." "We saved each other," he said simply, and it was true. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Daniel successfully roped the fence post, and Grace whooped in triumph. The twins appeared from behind the barn, covered in mud but grinning from ear to ear. Their lives were loud and messy and beautiful, nothing like the lonely existence both Elena and Dalton had known before they found each other. The years continued to unfold, bringing graduations and weddings and grandchildren. Daniel married a sweet school teacher from Fort Benton and took over the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Grace married a young lawyer and moved to Helena, where she became active in the women's suffrage movement, her mother's fierce independence burning bright in her activism. Henry went east to college and became a teacher, while James stayed on the ranch and proved to have a gift for horse training that surpassed even his father's skills. Elena and Dalton grew old together, their hair turning gray and their bodies moving slower. But their love remained as strong as it had been on that desperate night when she crawled bleeding to his door. They took long walks in the evenings, reminiscing about the early days when it had been just the two of them against the world. They spoiled their grandchildren shamelessly and dispensed advice to their children, whether it was wanted or not. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1899, surrounded by their children and grandchildren in the house Dalton had built with his own hands, Elena stood up to give a toast. She looked around the room at all the faces she loved, at the life she and Dalton had created from nothing but determination and hope, and a love that had survived every challenge thrown at it. 30 years ago, she began, her voice still strong despite her 70 years. I was dying in the dirt outside this house. I had been shot and abandoned, and I had no reason to believe I would see another sunrise. But there was a light in the window, and I crawled toward it because it was the only thing I could think to do. She looked at Dalton, who sat beside her with tears in his eyes. That light was you. You carried me inside and you saved my life. Not just that night, but every day since. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. You gave me love when I thought I would always be alone. You gave me a family and a purpose and a life beyond anything I ever imagined possible. She raised her glass. To my husband, my partner, my best friend, thank you for being the light in the darkness. Thank you for 30 years of love and laughter and adventure. Thank you for our children and our grandchildren and this beautiful life we have built together. I would do it all again in a heartbeat, every scary moment and every perfect one, because all of it brought me here to you. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Dalton stood and pulled Elena into his arms, kissing her soundly despite the whoops and teasing from their adult children. When he pulled back, he was smiling through his tears. You saved me too, he said quietly, just for her. I was so lonely before you came. I had land and cattle and a house, but I did not have a home. You made this a home. You made my life worth living. They held each other as their family celebrated around them, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting from that chance meeting on a desperate night. Elena and Dalton lived to see the new century arrive, holding hands on their porch as fireworks lit up the sky over Fort Benton in the distance. They lived to see automobiles and telephones and all the strange new inventions that were changing the world they had known. Through it all, they held on to each other and the values that had guided them through life: hard work, honesty, love, and the belief that every person deserved a second chance. Dalton passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1907 at the age of 75. Elena held his hand as he took his last breath, and she told him she loved him one more time. She knew he heard her. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, and Elena stood dry-eyed and strong, celebrating the life they had shared rather than mourning its end. She lived another 5 years, staying active in the Courier Service Administration until her final months. She spent her days writing in her journals, filling page after page with memories and stories for her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to read. She wrote about the Wild West as it had been, about the dangers and the beauty and the people who had carved lives out of raw wilderness. And she wrote about love, about the power of one person choosing to save another, about how a single moment of compassion could change the course of a life. Elena Bradshaw Kincaid died on a golden September afternoon in 1912, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words were, "Take me home to him," and they buried her next to Dalton on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, the ranch that would be passed down through generations of their family. On her gravestone, beneath her name and dates, her children had inscribed a simple message that captured the essence of her life. She crawled toward the light and found love waiting there. The Kincaid Ranch continued to prosper long after Elena and Dalton were gone. Their children and grandchildren maintained the land and the values that had been instilled in them, and the story of how it all began, the story of the woman who dragged herself bleeding to a cowboy's door and found salvation in his arms, became family legend passed down through the years. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set behind the mountains and the wind whispered through the grass, people said they could see two figures walking hand in hand across the hills, a tall cowboy and a strong woman, still together after all these years, still in love, still walking toward the light they had found in each other on that desperate night so long ago. Their love story became more than just family legend. It was written down in Elena's journals, which were eventually published by one of her great-grandchildren and became a testament to life in the Montana Territory during those wild, formative years. School children read about Elena's bravery and Dalton's compassion. Historians studied the journals for their detailed accounts of ranch life, courier routes, and the challenges faced by settlers in the late 1800s. But more than anything, it was remembered as a love story, proof that even in the hardest of times, even when death seemed certain and hope felt impossible, love could survive and flourish. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important thing we can do is open our door to someone in need, that a single act of kindness can ripple out through generations, creating beauty and legacy that lasts long after we are gone. The house where Dalton carried Elena that first night still stands on the ranch, preserved by the family as a reminder of where it all began. The room where Elena recovered from her wound, where she fell in love with the cowboy who saved her, where they spoke their first tentative words and began building the trust that would become their foundation, that room remains largely unchanged. The bed is still there, the window through which they watched for approaching danger, the door through which Dalton carried her to safety. Visitors to the ranch, family members, and history enthusiasts, and romantics drawn by the legend, often stand in that room and try to imagine what it was like, that desperate crawl through the darkness, that moment when strong arms lifted her and a deep voice promised safety. They look out at the land that Elena and Dalton built together, and they understand that this was more than just a ranch. It was a testament to the power of love to transform lives, to give meaning and purpose to existence, to create something beautiful and lasting out of pain and fear and desperate hope. The blood trail that Elena left that night washed away with the first rain. The men who shot her were tried and convicted, spending the rest of their lives in prison for attempted murder and theft. The gold shipment routes were changed, and because of Elena's courage in protecting those papers, the territorial government was able to prevent numerous robberies and save countless lives. She received multiple commendations for her service, though she always said the only reward she needed was the life she had built with Dalton. In the end, that was what mattered most, not the accolades or the successful business, or the land and cattle, and all the material things they had accumulated over the years. What mattered was the love they had shared, the family they had created, the example they had set for how to live with courage and compassion and unwavering commitment to each other. Their story was not perfect. They had arguments and disagreements, hard times and moments of doubt. There were years when the ranch barely broke even, when sickness threatened their children, when the weight of responsibility felt crushing. But through it all, they had each other. They faced every challenge as a team, supporting and encouraging and loving each other through the good times and the bad, and that was the real legacy of Elena and Dalton Kincaid. Not the ranch or the courier service or the businesses they built, but the example they set of what true partnership looked like, of what it meant to stand beside someone through everything life threw at you, of how love could not just survive, but thrive when it was tended and cherished and protected. Their great-great-grandchildren still work the ranch today, raising cattle and horses on the same land that Dalton claimed over a century and a half ago. They tell the story to their children, keeping alive the memory of the woman who crawled bleeding through the darkness, and the cowboy who carried her to safety, who saved her life and won her heart and built a legacy that would endure long after both of them were dust. Because in the end, that is what love does. It endures. It transforms. It creates something greater than the sum of its parts. Elena dragged herself to Dalton's ranch, bleeding and dying, and he carried her inside and saved her life. But the truth was deeper and more complex than that simple statement suggested. They saved each other. They gave each other purpose and meaning and a reason to keep going when times got hard. They created a life together that was richer and fuller than anything either of them could have built alone. And when people ask what the secret was, how they managed to stay in love for over 30 years in a time and place where life was hard and survival was never guaranteed, the answer was always the same. They chose each other every single day. They chose love over fear, partnership over independence, together over alone. They chose to see the best in each other, to forgive the mistakes and celebrate the victories, to hold on tight through the storms and dance together in the sunshine. That was the legacy of Elena and Dalton Kincaid. That was the story that echoed through generations, inspiring young couples to believe in the power of love, reminding older couples why they had chosen each other in the first place, proving that even in the darkest moments, when blood stains the ground and death seems certain, love can light the way home. The ranch stands today as a monument to that love, to those two people who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting from that chance meeting. The mountains still rise in the distance. The grass still grows golden in the summer sun. The wind still whispers through the eaves of the house where it all began. And if you listen closely on quiet evenings when the sun sets behind the peaks and the world grows still, you might hear the echo of laughter, the murmur of two voices speaking softly to each other, the sound of a love that refused to die, even when the people who created it had long since passed into memory. You might see two shadows walking hand in hand across the hills, still together, still in love, still finding their way toward each other through the darkness. Because that is what true love does. It endures beyond death, beyond time, beyond everything that tries to diminish or destroy it. It lives on in the hearts of those who remember, in the stories that are told, in the legacy that is passed down from generation to generation. Elena dragged herself to Dalton's ranch, bleeding bad. The cowboy carried her in and saved her life. And from that moment of desperate need and compassionate response, a love story was born that would inspire people for over a century, proving that sometimes the most important journey we take is not across miles of wilderness, but across the distance between two hearts learning to beat as one.